It was early morning at JFK Airport, and the terminal was buzzing with the usual mix of tired travelers and busy staff rushing between gates. A tall man in his 40s walked quietly through the crowd, holding only a small black carry-on and a laptop bag. He looked calm, focused, and a little tired from a long week of back-to-back meetings. His clothes were simple, just a clean white shirt, navy jacket, and a pair of polished shoes. There was nothing flashy about him, but something in the way he carried himself drew quiet respect from people who noticed him. He stopped for a moment near the coffee counter, checked his watch, and then continued walking toward Gate 17. The loudspeaker announced boarding for Flight 221 to Los Angeles. He smiled faintly. This was his last trip before a much-needed weekend off. He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who scanned it and said, "First class. Welcome aboard." He thanked her politely and walked toward the plane. When he reached the front of the aircraft, the flight attendant gave him a polite smile, then glanced down at his ticket again as if double-checking. Her smile tightened a little. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" she asked. He handed it to her, still calm, wondering if maybe there was a technical issue. She scanned it again and looked over her shoulder toward the first-class seats. Then she leaned in slightly and said quietly, "I'm so sorry, but there seems to be a mix-up with your seat. It looks like it was reassigned in the system." He frowned slightly, not angry, just confused. "Reassigned?" he asked. "That's strange. I booked this seat weeks ago." The attendant avoided his eyes. "Yes, sir, I understand, but it appears another passenger has been seated there. Could I ask you to wait just a moment while I sort it out?" He nodded. "Of course." He stepped aside, letting others board behind him. He stood near the doorway, watching passengers take their seats. Then a few moments later, he saw a younger man, probably in his early 30s, walk past him and take the exact first-class seat printed on his ticket. The man looked confident, maybe a little entitled, and didn't seem to notice anything unusual. The attendant came back and said softly, "Sir, I'm afraid we'll need to ask you to take a seat in the economy section for now. We'll sort things out once we're in the air." He raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me to move to economy?" She nodded quickly. "Just for now, sir. There's been an error in our system. We'll compensate you for the inconvenience." There was a small pause. He looked down at his boarding pass again, then back at her. For a brief moment, a dozen thoughts ran through his mind. He could insist on the seat he paid for. He could make a scene, call for a supervisor, or refuse to move. But instead, he took a deep breath and smiled faintly. "That's fine," he said. "I'll take the seat." The attendant looked relieved. "Thank you for understanding, sir. I truly apologize." He nodded and followed her to the back of the plane. The cabin grew quieter as passengers settled in. A few people glanced up when they saw him walking down the aisle, perhaps wondering why a man who clearly didn't belong in economy was being seated there. But he didn't seem bothered. He simply placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and pulled out his laptop. The flight took off a few minutes later. The man in his seat by the window put on his headphones and fell asleep. The CEO, sitting there in the cramped row, opened his laptop and started typing notes for the presentation he was giving the next day. It wasn't just any presentation. It was for a major airline partnership, one that could bring his company $150 million in new business. As he worked, he noticed the flight attendant from earlier passing by. She slowed down near his row, clearly uncomfortable.
"Sir, would you like a drink?"
"Oh, it's on the house," she said softly. He looked up, smiled politely, and said, "Water would be fine, thank you." She handed it to him quickly and walked away. He could sense she felt guilty, but he didn't want to make it harder for her. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated differently because of assumptions people made about him, but it was one of the few times it had happened so plainly, right in front of others and without reason. As the hours passed, the cabin lights dimmed. He leaned back and watched the clouds drift past the window. His thoughts wandered, not to anger, but reflection. He thought about all the young people in his company who looked up to him, who saw his success as proof that hard work could break barriers. He thought about how easily dignity could be taken away in a moment, not because of who you are, but because of how someone else chooses to see you. The flight attendant came by again near the end of the flight, this time kneeling slightly beside his seat. "Sir, I want to apologize again," she said quietly. "There was an error in our system, but I realize it wasn't handled properly." "I'm very sorry," he smiled gently. "It's okay," he said. I appreciate you saying that. She hesitated, then asked, "If you don't mind me asking, do you travel often?" He nodded. "Quite a bit. Too much, maybe?" She smiled awkwardly, not knowing what else to say. "Well, thank you for being patient," she said, and stood up to continue her work. When the plane landed in Los Angeles, he waited until most passengers had left before standing. He opened the overhead bin, took out his bag, and walked toward the front. As he passed through first class, he noticed the same man still sitting in the seat that should have been his. Their eyes met for a moment. The younger man seemed to realize something. Perhaps he had overheard enough during the flight to understand what had happened. He gave an awkward nod, but the CEO just smiled faintly and walked out. Outside the plane, he walked through the terminal without rushing. The California sun poured through the glass windows and people hurried past him, each lost in their own world. He stopped near a window overlooking the runway. For a few moments he stood there quietly thinking. He wasn't angry anymore. He had learned long ago that anger only drained energy he could use for something better. What stayed with him wasn't the seat or the inconvenience. It was the reminder that no matter how far he had come, some people still saw only the surface. And yet he also knew something they didn't. Power doesn't always need to raise its voice. Sometimes it only needs to wait for the right moment. Later that night, he sat in his hotel room, reviewing the final presentation slides for the next day's meeting. The company he was meeting with was the very same airline he had flown on that morning. They had been in talks for months, negotiating a deal that would modernize their technology systems. It was a massive project, one that could change the direction of both companies. He looked at the airline's logo on the front slide and paused. He thought about the attendant's uncomfortable smile, the passengers' silent stares, the quiet humiliation of being told to move for someone else. Then, slowly he closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. The city lights sparkled outside his window, and the hum of distant traffic filled the silence. He thought about what his father used to tell him when he was young. "Son, the real measure of a person isn't how they act when they're treated well, it's how they act when they're not." He smiled to himself. The flight had been unpleasant, yes, but it had also revealed something he couldn't ignore. If this was how their company treated one person quietly sitting on a plane, how many others were treated the same way without anyone ever knowing? He decided not to let anger lead the way. He would handle it the same way he handled everything in his career, with calm, precision, and dignity. Before going to bed, he wrote a short note in his phone. Tomorrow's meeting isn't just about business, it's about values. Then he turned off the light, knowing that what happened on that flight was more than just a misunderstanding. It was a moment that would test not just his patience but his principles. The next morning, when he woke up, the sun was already bright. He dressed in a sharp gray suit, put on his watch, and took one last look in the mirror. His reflection was calm, focused, and ready. He didn't know that by the end of the day, the same airline that had denied him a seat would lose something far more valuable than a first-class ticket. They would lose a deal worth $150 million and learn a lesson they would never forget. The sun had just started rising over downtown Los Angeles when he stepped out of his hotel, holding a small cup of black coffee. The morning air was cool and the city was slowly waking up. Cars hummed along the boulevard and people hurried to work, unaware that inside one tall glass building across the street, an important meeting was about to take place, one that could change everything for both sides. He walked calmly toward the building, his step steady and his face calm. From the outside, no one would guess that the man who had been quietly downgraded to economy class the day before was the same man now heading to finalize a deal worth $150 million. To him, business was never about showing power. It was about earning respect. And after what had happened on that flight, respect was all he could think about. When he reached the lobby, the receptionist greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. The conference room is ready. The airline team arrived a few minutes ago." He nodded politely, took a breath, and followed her toward the elevators. The doors closed, and as the elevator rose, he glanced at his reflection in the mirrored wall. His face was calm, but his mind wasn't quiet. He kept thinking about the attendant from yesterday, the nervous tone in her voice, the way she had looked down instead of meeting his eyes. It wasn't hate he'd seen. It was habit. The habit of assuming who belonged and who didn't. The elevator chimed softly and the doors opened to the top floor. A large sign read, Sky Reach Airlines, Executive Boardroom. He stepped inside. The room was bright, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. Around the long glass table sat several executives, men and women in sharp suits, chatting and checking their phones. But the moment he walked in, the conversation stopped. A few of them stood to shake his hand, smiling politely. "Good morning. We're so glad to have you here," said one of the senior executives, a tall man with silver hair. "We've been looking forward to closing this partnership." The CEO smiled and shook his hand. "Good morning. I'm glad to be here too," he said. He took his seat at the head of the table. His assistant set down a slim laptop and a folder. Across from him sat the airline's director of operations, a woman in her 50s who looked confident but tired. When she looked up and met his eyes, a flicker of surprise crossed her face. For a moment she froze. Then recognition hit her. Her lips parted slightly, and her expression changed from polite to pale. He noticed. He knew exactly who she was. She was the same director who had personally authorized yesterday's seat adjustment for that very flight. For a few seconds, silence filled the room. The others didn't notice at first, but she did. Her fingers fidgeted with a pen. The CEO gave a polite nod as though acknowledging her for the first time. "It's nice to meet you in person," he said. Her voice shook slightly as she replied, "Yes, of course. It's good to finally meet you too." The presentation began. One of his team members opened the slides, showing data charts, profit forecasts, and diagrams of the new system Eric Systems would be installing. Everyone listened attentively, taking notes and nodding. But while they spoke about numbers, his thoughts kept returning to something deeper, the idea of worth, of how easily people could overlook others when titles weren't visible. When it was his turn to speak, he stood and moved to the front of the room. "First, I want to thank everyone here for your time," he began, his tone calm and sincere. "We've been working toward this partnership for a long time, and we believe it could benefit both companies in extraordinary ways." The executives nodded. One of them said, "We're excited too. This project will position us as the most advanced airline in the region." He smiled faintly, then paused. His voice softened. "But before we continue, there's something I'd like to share." Everyone looked up, curious. He closed the laptop in front of him and clasped his hands together. "Yesterday I flew here on one of your flights," he said slowly. "I was traveling alone on a first-class ticket, but when I boarded I was told there was a mix-up. My seat was reassigned to another passenger, and I was asked to move to economy. I didn't argue. I just sat quietly." The room went still. A few executives glanced at one another. The director of operations froze completely, her hand tightening around the pen until it almost broke. "I didn't mention my name," he continued. "I didn't say I was the CEO of the company you're meeting with today. I wanted to see how the situation would be handled. Sometimes the truest lessons about a company's values don't come from contracts or presentations. They come from small moments when no one's watching." No one moved. The air felt heavier now. One man shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another stared at the table, avoiding his eyes. He turned toward the director of operations. "I believe you were the one who approved the seat change," he said gently, not accusingly. She swallowed hard. Yes, I was informed about the issue. I didn't know it was you," he nodded. "That's the point," he said softly. "You shouldn't have needed to know it was me to treat the situation differently." The silence stretched. Outside the windows, the city glimmered in the morning light, but inside the tension was thick. Everyone in the room understood what had just happened, even without words. He took a slow breath. "I built my company on fairness and integrity. Those are the values I live by. They guide every partnership I enter. But when I saw how your airline handled a simple mistake, how quickly an assumption was made, it made me question if our values truly align." One of the executives tried to interject. "Sir, I assure you this was an isolated—" He raised a hand gently. "I understand. Mistakes happen. But what defines a company isn't the mistake itself. It's how people behave when they think no one of importance is watching." The words sank into the room like a quiet echo. The CEO didn't need to raise his voice. His calm tone carried more weight than anger ever could. Finally, he looked at the folder on the table, the official contract for the $150 million deal. He placed his hand on it, paused, and then slowly closed it. "I came here today ready to sign," he said quietly. "But after what I experienced, I can't in good conscience move forward with this partnership. I need to work with companies that understand respect is not something reserved for a few. It's something owed to everyone." Gasps filled the room. The senior executive leaned forward urgently. "Please, let's discuss this. We can address it internally. We value this relationship deeply." He nodded respectfully. "I know you do, and I value the effort your team's put in. But this isn't about punishment, it's about principle." He stood up slowly, collecting his folder. "Thank you for your time," he said. "I wish you the best moving forward." He turned and began walking toward the door. Behind him, chairs shifted and whispers broke out. The director of operations called out, her voice trembling. "Please wait. I'm truly sorry for what happened. I'll take full responsibility. We'll make it right." He paused at the doorway, then turned slightly. "I appreciate that," he said gently. "But this isn't about me. It's about the culture that allows things like that to happen. Fix that and maybe someday we'll talk again." With that, he walked out. The hallway outside was silent. He exhaled deeply, letting go of the tension he had been carrying since that flight. His assistant caught up with him, her expression a mix of surprise and admiration. "You really walked away from it?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "Some things are worth more than contracts," he said. "Respect is one of them." They left the building quietly. Down below, the city continued its usual rhythm. Cars moving, people walking, phones ringing. No one outside that glass tower knew what had just happened inside. But for him, it wasn't about headlines or attention. It was about staying true to himself. Later that afternoon, as he sat in the back of a car heading to the airport, his phone buzzed nonstop, calls from reporters, from colleagues, from industry insiders already hearing rumors of the canceled deal. He didn't answer any of them. He simply looked out the window and watched the city fade behind him. He knew the story would spread eventually. Someone in that boardroom would talk, or maybe the airline itself would leak it in an attempt to explain. But he didn't mind. He wasn't interested in revenge or fame. He only wanted to remind people that success meant nothing if you lost your sense of humanity along the way. As the car pulled up to the airport, he looked at the planes taking off in the distance. One of them bore the same airline logo from yesterday. For a moment, he wondered if the same flight attendant was working today. He hoped she was doing okay. He didn't blame her anymore. He understood that real change begins not from blame, but from awareness. He picked up his bag, thanked the driver, and walked toward the terminal. This time, he didn't care what class his ticket said. What mattered most to him was that he'd walked away from that meeting with his dignity intact, and in doing so, had reminded everyone else in that room what true leadership looked like. When he walked out of that meeting room, he left behind more than a canceled deal. He left behind a message that none of those executives would forget. For years, people had told him that power came from how much money you made, how big your company was, or how many people worked under you. But standing in that boardroom, watching their faces fall as he calmly withdrew his offer, he realized something far greater. True power came from the ability to walk away with dignity. Later that evening, he sat quietly in the airport lounge, waiting for his return flight home. His phone had been buzzing all day, messages from his board members, investors, and friends in the business world. They all wanted to know the same thing. Why did he walk away from such a massive contract? To them, $150 million wasn't just a deal. It was a milestone. But to him, the decision was already made. He took a deep breath, sipped his tea, and looked around the lounge. It was filled with people from all walks of life. Tired travelers, families with kids, young professionals staring at their screens. No one there knew who he was, and he liked it that way. He was just another traveler waiting for a plane. As he sat there, a young man nearby recognized him. He whispered to his friend, "That's the guy from Eric Systems, right?" The friend nodded, surprised. "What's he doing sitting here alone?" The CEO overheard them and smiled faintly. He wasn't offended. He understood the curiosity. People expected success to come with bodyguards and attention, but he preferred peace over praise. He boarded his flight quietly, this time on another airline. The staff greeted him warmly, and as he sat in his seat, he felt the tension in his shoulders ease for the first time in days. When the plane took off, he closed his eyes and let the hum of the engines drown out his thoughts. By the time he landed back home, the story had already begun to spread. Someone from inside the boardroom, maybe an assistant or a junior executive, had shared details with a journalist. Within hours, news outlets were talking about the mysterious CEO who walked away from a $150 million deal. At first, the articles were vague, only mentioning that the deal had been canceled unexpectedly, but soon small details began to surface. One headline read, "CEO cancels airline contract after first-class incident." Another read, "Billion-dollar company ends partnership over mistreatment." During flight, he didn't say a word publicly. He didn't post on social media or release a statement. But silence, he knew, sometimes spoke louder than explanations. The public began filling in the blanks, and people started debating online. Some said he had overreacted. Others called him a hero for standing up for respect and dignity. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, chaos had erupted. The meeting had ended hours ago, but its impact was just beginning. The director of operations, the same woman who had approved his seat change, was now facing questions from every direction. Executives demanded answers, shareholders wanted explanations, and the public relations team was working around the clock trying to control the damage. The CEO's quiet decision had turned into a storm the company couldn't contain. A few days later, the airline released a short statement claiming it was reviewing the incident and that it had tremendous respect for all its customers. But by then, screenshots of witness accounts had already gone viral. Passengers from that flight began posting online, saying they had seen what happened, how he had been asked to move, how calm he'd stayed, and how no one had spoken up. One post read, "I was on that flight. The man they asked to move to economy was polite, calm, and kind. He didn't make a scene. Later I found out who he was, and honestly, I've never respected anyone more." Another comment said, "It wasn't about a seat. It was about how someone was treated, and he handled it better than most of us ever could." Within a week, the story became one of the most talked about business moments of the year. News anchors discussed it on television, podcasts analyzed it, and social media flooded with opinions. Some people praised his patience. Others criticized the airline's behavior. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. His silence made the story more powerful. While all this was happening, he continued his usual routine. He went to work, attended meetings, and focused on his team. When his assistant mentioned how the story was going viral, he simply said, "Let the truth speak for itself." But behind that calmness, he was thinking deeply. He knew stories like this came and went quickly in the media. In a few weeks, people would move on to something new. But he didn't want this moment to fade without meaning. He wanted it to serve as a reminder, not of revenge, but of reflection. That evening, he called a meeting with his leadership team. They gathered in the company's main conference room, where large windows overlooked the city skyline. Everyone was eager to hear what he would say. He stood at the front of the room and spoke softly. "You've all seen what's happening online," he began, "and I know you've received questions about it. I want you to remember something. Our company stands for fairness, humility, and integrity. I didn't walk away from that deal because of pride. I walked away because respect should never be negotiable." The room was silent. His words carried more weight than any press release ever could. He continued, "There are people who will see this as a bold business move, and others who will see it as emotional. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that we set an example. The world is watching how we react, and I want them to see that doing the right thing doesn't need to be loud." His team nodded, some visibly emotional. They admired him not just as a leader, but as a person who practiced what he preached. That same night, as he was leaving the office, he stopped by the security desk. The guard, an older man who had worked there for years, smiled and said, "Sir, I saw the story. What you did was right. People need to see that not everything is about money." The CEO smiled and replied, "Sometimes losing money means gaining self-respect." The guard nodded. "That's true. You reminded people of that." Over the next few weeks, the airline's stock price dipped slightly as public criticism grew. Customers began sharing their own experiences, some positive, others not. The company launched new sensitivity and customer service programs, promising to learn and improve. Whether they did it out of genuine change or fear of backlash, no one knew. But at least the conversation had started. For the CEO, life went on as usual. He still traveled often, still attended conferences, and still met with clients. But everywhere he went, people wanted to talk about that one flight. Some told him how his story inspired them to stand up for themselves in their own workplaces. Others said it made them rethink how they treated people around them. One day during a university guest lecture, a student stood up and asked, "Sir, when that happened on the plane, weren't you angry?" He smiled softly. "Of course I was," he said. "But anger doesn't solve much. I've learned that staying calm doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're in control of your strength." The student nodded, and the room filled with quiet respect. That night, after returning home, he sat by the window of his study. The city lights flickered below, and a gentle rain began to fall. He opened his laptop and wrote a short message that he would later post online, not for attention but for clarity. Dignity is not something that can be bought or sold. It is earned through our actions, especially when no one else is watching. Always choose respect, for yourself and for others. Within minutes, the post began spreading, shared by people across industries, countries, and backgrounds. Some called it the quote of the year, but for him, it was just a simple truth. As the rain continued outside, he leaned back and thought about how quickly life could turn from ordinary to extraordinary, how one quiet choice, made without anger, could ripple across the world. He didn't plan for it to happen this way. He never wanted fame or attention, but perhaps this was how change began, not through shouting, but through quiet courage. And as he turned off the lights and looked out at the city below, he whispered to himself, "Maybe this is what leadership really means, standing tall when it would be easier to sit down." Days had passed since the story went viral, yet the wave it created kept growing. It was no longer just a business story. It had become something much bigger, a conversation about respect, leadership, and quiet strength. Everywhere he went, people seemed to recognize him now. Some smiled politely, others stopped him to say thank you. But he never acted like a celebrity. He always responded with the same calm smile and soft tone. He wasn't looking for attention. He was looking for meaning. One morning, he sat by the large glass window of his office, watching the city buzz below. The noise of car horns and distant construction filled the air. But inside the room, everything felt still. On the table before him were stacks of documents from new companies eager to work with Eric's systems. His assistant came in with a few more proposals and placed them gently in front of him. "You've received 7 new partnership requests just this week," she said. "Seems like everyone wants to work with you now." He smiled faintly, looking at the papers but not rushing to open them. "Funny, isn't it?" he said. "A week ago, no one was talking about integrity. Now it's a selling point," she smiled softly. "Sometimes it takes one example for others to remember what really matters." He nodded. "Maybe so." He leaned back in his chair and thought about everything that had happened. The viral posts, the news interviews, the way strangers online defended him even though they had never met him. It was strange. He never meant for any of this to happen. All he had done was stand by his values. But now those values had become a symbol for others. Later that day, his phone rang. It was a familiar voice and the chairman of the same airline he had walked away from. The call surprised him, but he answered politely. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," the voice replied. There was a pause. "I wanted to reach out personally. I owe you an apology." The CEO stayed silent for a moment, letting the words settle. The chairman continued, "We've been reviewing everything that happened. The way your situation was handled was unacceptable, and I want you to know that we've taken immediate steps to address it. The employees involved have been retrained, and we're changing our internal protocols to ensure nothing like this happens again." The CEO listened quietly. He could tell the apology was sincere, not scripted. "I appreciate you saying that," he said finally. "It's not about blame. It's about awareness. Sometimes people don't realize how their small actions can hurt others." The chairman agreed. "You're right. What you did, walking away from the deal, it made us face something we've ignored for too long. I respect that. And though it cost us, I think we needed it." The CEO smiled faintly. Then maybe something good came out of it after all. There was another pause before the chairman spoke again. "If you're open to it, I'd like to meet in person someday, not to talk business, but to learn. We want to do better." "I'd be happy to," he replied. When the call ended, he sat quietly for a long time, staring out at the skyline. It wasn't satisfaction he felt, it was peace. For the first time since that flight, he felt a sense of closure. Not because he won anything, but because a lesson had been learned on both sides. A few days later, he was invited to speak at a leadership conference. The organizers wanted him to share his experience and the values that guided his decision. He agreed, though he wasn't a fan of public attention. He believed stories only had power if they could inspire others to act differently. The auditorium was packed the day of the event. Leaders from different industries sat in the audience waiting for his talk. When he stepped onto the stage, dressed in a simple dark suit, the room went silent. There were no flashy lights or background music, just his voice calm and steady. He began, "I've been in business for over 20 years. I've seen companies rise and fall, deals made and broken. But the most important thing I've learned isn't about profit or competition. It's about people." He paused, scanning the crowd. "A few weeks ago, I was asked to give up a seat I had paid for. Not because of an error in the system, but because someone else was assumed to deserve it more." That moment wasn't about a seat. It was about how we treat others when we think no one will notice. The audience listened closely. Some leaned forward in their chairs, others nodded quietly. "I didn't walk away from that deal out of anger," he continued. "I walked away because respect should never be optional. When we compromise our values for comfort or profit, we lose something far more valuable, our integrity." He told the story simply, without drama, without pointing fingers. He focused on the lessons. The power of staying calm when provoked, the importance of leading with empathy, the courage to do the right thing even when it costs something. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. But instead of pride, what he felt was gratitude. Gratitude that his quiet choice had sparked conversations far beyond that single flight. After the event, people came up to him one by one. Some were executives. Others were students. One woman, a young manager from a small company, told him, "Your story made me rethink how I treat my employees. I realized respect starts from the top." He smiled warmly. "That's all I ever hoped for," he said. That night, he returned home feeling lighter. He sat in his living room with a cup of tea, thinking about how far he'd come, not just in his career, but in understanding people. He thought about his parents, who had raised him to stay grounded no matter how high he climbed. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Son, your worth isn't in your title. It's in your character." He looked around the quiet room and whispered softly, "You were right, Dad." As the weeks went by, the world slowly moved on to new stories. The headlines faded, the hashtag stopped trending, but the impact lingered. The airline quietly rolled out new training programs and even created a diversity and ethics committee to review customer experiences. The CEO heard about it through industry channels and smiled. He didn't need credit. Knowing it happened was enough. One afternoon, he received a letter in the mail. It wasn't typed and it was handwritten. The writing was neat but slightly shaky. He opened it carefully and read, "Dear Sir, I was the flight attendant on your flight that day. I've wanted to reach out but didn't know how. I wanted to say thank you, not because you forgave me, but because you handled everything with kindness. That day changed how I see my job and the people I serve. You taught me something I'll never forget." He sat there quietly, reading the letter twice. Then he folded it gently and placed it in his drawer. It wasn't the apology that mattered. It was the growth that came from it. That evening, he took a walk through the park near his home. The air was cool and children played under the fading sunlight. He watched them laugh and chase each other, their joy simple and pure. For a moment, he thought about how the world often made people forget what truly mattered: kindness, empathy, respect. Yet moments like this reminded him that change didn't have to start with grand speeches or big movements. It could start with one person deciding to do the right thing. As the sun set, he stood by the lake, watching the reflection of the sky ripple in the water. His phone buzzed again. More messages, more news, more opportunities. But he didn't rush to check them. He let the peace of that quiet moment sink in. He had learned something from all of this too. That leadership wasn't about control or prestige. It was about responsibility. The responsibility to stay true to your values even when no one else does. And as he walked home, the city lights flickering on around him, he smiled softly to himself. He had lost a deal but gained something far greater. Proof that character still mattered in a world that often forgot it.